Let's talk about a book that was written about 20 years ago by a writer, Tom Engelhardt. It's called The End of Victory Culture. Tom Engelhardt has gone on to found and manage a website called Tom Dispatch, which has done some great coverage of U.S. Foreign policy and the war on terror. And before that, before he wrote this book, he was an editor at, I think it was Pantheon Books, which used to be a great, relatively independent press that put out, really good works of fiction, of politics and sociology. And after that, Pantheon's still out there, but it's a different press than it was. In between those two things, Tom Engelhardt wrote this book, The End of Victory Culture, and it's about the U.S. in the post-World War II era, which is an era that I find particularly fascinating as a U.S. citizen myself, and one whose family members lived through it or were born in it. It feels haunting to me lately, especially the last few years, as the U.S. Shows various signs of entering a moment of really profound transformation, I guess is a fairly neutral way of saying it, because the post-war moment was so unusual in U.S. history and provoked a lot of cultural challenges, and the answers to those challenges still kind of like form the sense of what's possible in the U.S. today. So I am always looking for good books and good works that can sort of guide me through that period, and this is one of them. Engelhardt makes the point that in the book that the U.S. before World War II was a smaller, less militarized, more isolated country. Before World War II, the U.S. did not have a draft. Its military was very small relative to what it became, and it had very much a sense of being a world unto itself, which led to the political trends called isolationism that kept the U.S. sort of at a distance from the world's problems, even through the first couple years of World War II. There was very much a sense that the U.S. was sort of a city on a hill, but one that didn't really need to have any relationship with any other societies. Not seriously, that they were all, in some sense, potential corrupting influences, and the U.S. would do better to stay away. This was very strong and powerful in the culture. It's one of the things that the U.S. eventually joining World War II and helping to win the war has sort of hidden from a lot of people's sense of history, which is just how disinterested in being involved U.S. public was right up until Pearl Harbor. The first couple of years of the war did not provoke any movement to join. There were all sorts of influence operations in the U.S. By all sides: Germany, Italy, Great Britain. Great Britain, of course, wanted the U.S. to be more involved and wanted to get support for its efforts, and they put a lot of work into trying to create cultural touchstones and even influence U.S. Political elections throughout the war to make sure that support for Britain would stay positive. But even up to Pearl Harbor, polls would sometimes show that far less than half the country was interested in getting involved. And frankly, FDR, the president at the time, who did support Britain and did want the U.S. to be more involved, did not feel he could go beyond public sentiment. And U.S. support for Britain and the Allied cause in general was very lukewarm and small and inconstant all the way to Pearl Harbor, when things suddenly spun on a dime, when with the sneak attack of Pearl Harbor and the U.S. Declaring war on Japan, and then when Germany declared war on the U.S. in support of the Japanese, it made it easier for the U.S. to declare war on Germany. And then throughout the war, there was a more or less there was a political effort to defeat Germany first. It felt important among U.S. leadership that Germany was much more dangerous than Japan, and so they needed to be defeated first. But the public's interest in the war ran more towards the War of Japan, where the country had felt tangibly attacked. And so there was this effort to, while on the one side devoting the bulk of the war effort to fighting with Germany, to publicize the elements of the War of Japan more strongly, because that's what the public was more interested in. Anyway, when the war ended, the U.S. was in a position that it did not fit well with its historical sense of itself. The U.S. at the end of World War II was basically the only industrial country that had not been savaged by warfare. All of the major European countries had either been invaded or bombed. The Soviet Union lost some just insanely large amount of people to the chaos and carnage of the war. Something like 20 million. It's almost hard to grasp. China was not an industrial nation yet, and of course Japan had been firebombed and had sunk all of its productivity into war, which it had then lost. So the U.S., I believe the estimate I read is that at the end of the war, the U.S. owned something like 70% of the industrial capacity of the planet Earth. 70%. In one country that only has a few percent of the world's people. And it became relatively apparent that if they were going to hold that position, they did need to make efforts to rebuild the world, essentially, to rebuild their partners, to get involved. And so for the first time, with relative, there are a few cultural precedents, but they were not absorbed widely into the culture at the time. I'm thinking here of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. conquest of Hawaii, and the various, what are sometimes called the Banana Wars before World War II, where the U.S. got involved in various land wars. But these did not make a big impression on the population of the U.S. as a whole. They didn't involve really large numbers of its people, and they certainly didn't lead to a reconception of its role in the world. The U.S. has always had a sense that it was special and a leader among nations, but if you, for most of its history, that role has been more symbolic and sort of lead by example. It doesn't mean anyone would do any actual work. I don't think that's exaggerating. It's more that, last best hope of mankind by setting the example for others to copy, not by going out and getting directly involved in other societies. But at the end of World War II, it did not seem like there was much choice. So the U.S. begins to build the vast network of international institutions, which were already being built before the war had formally ended, once it was clear that the outcome was no longer in doubt. And they also begin to build, international trade, international finance, international aid. All of this builds very strongly from the end of the war in 1945 until about 1970, I would say. It's a major investment in the nation. It can't be easily ignored. It came with a whole array of cultural paraphernalia to support this new image of the U.S. as sort of the active um, guider, that's a bad word, the active, let's say referee of human societies and their various destinies. So you get all sorts of books and movies and magazine articles and radio shows that either symbolically or actually talk about the U.S. as being a much more active player in the world. I'm not saying that they do this accurately or without, implicit harm done through like condescension or racism. But the point is, it's like the U.S. has won the war. Now we have to win the peace. You know, we have to do better. People were very concerned that this would repeat, and it would be like the end of World War One, where it was felt that the issues involved had failed, and so it set up the even greater horror of World War Two. So it's like, no, we can't do that again. We've got to keep going. We've got to settle these things, and it was very quickly realized that the Soviet Union, though it had been a vital maybe the vital nation in the struggle against Nazi Germany, that they were not going to join this effort. There were brief attempts that were scuttled by mutual distrust, but there were brief attempts to bring the Soviet Union into the overall rebuilding of the world idea that the U.S. had, but the U.S. did not trust the Soviet Union very much. Soviet Union did not trust the U.S. to not undermine its legitimacy as the ruler of Russia and these other countries, and so we settled into the kind of the mutual suspicion and recrimination and paranoia that defined the Cold War. It's interesting to look back and imagine that as a missed opportunity, though. The Soviet Union desperately needed something like the Marshall Plan to rebuild at the end of the war, but the caveats that the U.S. attached to it were just unacceptable to them, and so they decided to just go ahead and rebuild on their own, which, they're a large enough country with large enough people that despite the horrendous toll the war took, they were able to do that. Okay. So the culture of the U.S. at the end of World War II began to, and this is actually weaving into Engelhardt's book now, shift from a we are special and lead by example to we are victors. I think that's roughly Engelhardt's idea, is that the U.S. previously had a sense of itself as a very special place with unique rights and constitution and destiny in the world, perhaps, but that this did not necessarily involve victory. The U.S. was in World War I and was happy to have won, and there was this outburst of patriotism, but it did not fully the effort involved in World War I was too short, and the draft did not hold, and so on, and so it did not make the kind of permanent impress. But World War II lasted long enough, and then the draft, which lasted until 1973, and gave every man in the country some kind of relationship with the military, even if it was a negative one, really implanted the roots of this, like, we are victors. I've talked to my father about this occasionally, and he says, oh yeah, when he was little, there was this talk always that the U.S. has never lost a war, which is something that, if your knowledge of history is fairly you could if you have a fairly I don't want to say shallow, you can see it that way. You can see it that way if you want, I guess. You have to elide a lot. You have to glide over a lot of things. You have to call certain things not wars that were wars at the time. But okay, whatever. The U.S. has never lost a war. And this is where Engelhardt's book jumps in, because I think he was a child of this time, and so he knew it quite well. And So what he does is says, okay, well, now that we are victors, what kind of culture do victors create? You know, and he has some fabulous parts of the book just about the overall culture from about 1945 to about 1970 about victory culture. It's about like the movies that are made, the books, and especially the childhood of people growing up in victory culture. The toys, the games, the playing of war, the mixing of elements from pop culture into sort of a grandiose mythology of what it means to be a victor. Really great, gripping. This is one of those books I don't think I could read anything else till I finished. And a fascinating ride through the world of a kid growing up in that era and what they would take from it. What would be like the implicit assumptions, even if they wound up directing these attitudes at different targets. I might be making this up. This might not be in the book, but one thing that I took away in terms of thought, thinking about this book years later, is a lot of the people who wound up rebelling against the U.S. establishment in the 50s, 60s, 70s, were doing what they thought that they should do based on their sense of their country and how it worked. A lot of them were acting out of patriotic, productive motives in exposing falsehood and hypocrisy and doing what I think Philip Roth called the demythologizing of the U.S. This was seen as important so that we could continue to achieve. Not to tear everything down for negative, destructive purposes. I know there are people like that, but I think many more of them were actually trying to live out in their life these victorious values, because this is what victors do. They expose, they puncture, they deflate pretension. And this is what they were thought they were supposed to do. To some degree, it is supremely human, perhaps, to raise children to pursue a certain vision of the world, but never expect them to direct that back. Never, to have an inflated and an exalted sense of the country, and then have people actually go out and try to do it, to try to produce that from what they see as the inadequate present around them. This is a moment of, I don't know how to put it, great cultural, prosperity. The U.S. felt so rich and important from, roughly the end of the war until the late 60s, when the other economies of the world started to rebuild and catch up and compete more effectively. That 20 years or so, 45 to 65, must have just felt ebullient, and like you had to try really hard to stand out from a tide that just kept rising. And so if you wanted to earn distinction and to stand out, you had to really push. But the resources were there to help you. There were opportunities everywhere. There were jobs of every sort. There were brand new institutions. You could start new institutions and reasonably expect to have the chance to figure out how to make them work. Not like now, where you get a bank loan and they want your business to start showing a profit immediately. There's no time to wait. It's more demanding where we are now because we're competing so much harder. We're not back at that point of 70% of the world's industry in our country. I mean, I think we're at about 20 to 25, which is still, very rich and fine from one point of view. But if you grew up with those expectations, it's less fine, even though historically 2025 is more like where the U.S. might historically be. coming down from that wave must have felt like failure and rejection and some sort of internal fault, which maybe called for all of the excoriating and the forgetfulness and the erasure of the past that went on in the 70s and 80s, the rejection of older models in search of all sorts of exotic alternatives, and eventually settling on a kind of streamlined version of work and success, but without the sort of the big story. I don't think anyone knows right now what the big story for the U.S. is. I'm really not sure that they do. And if they said they did, I'm not sure I would believe them. I certainly wouldn't be accepted by anything like a majority of the country, and even the large minority would probably disagree quite often on some very important details. It's profoundly interesting, captivating. That's the word. It's captivating to watch the cultural negativism in the U.S. today creeping through almost every institution and name, even if it's not fair or honest or directed at the right thing. What's important is that it's like omnipresent. It's everywhere, right, left, religious, secular, regional, national, just this kind of general creeping negativity. And it's hard to imagine it ever going away at the moment. And so to walk back to this post-war moment when, whether the messaging was correct or not, the positive attitude, the attitude of being born into a special place with unique opportunities and with the resources to support those opportunities and give them real heft. I know I'm not talking about the entire country. I'm just talking about kind of like the mainstream establishment institutions. You can see how people born and molded by that moment might not recognize the country today and their role in it quite as easily, and they might either retreat makes it sound, they might either move into various states of illusion or of cynicism. And I think a lot of that is happening among the people who by this point should be our kind of leaders and guiders and guiders. I can't get away from that word. The guides they are the honest ones are looking at the scope of the problem and weeping, and the dishonest ones are denying that large sections of the problem exist and insisting that we do have problems, but they're small and manageable. So yeah, I can't recommend Engelhardt's book strongly enough. It's really thoughtful. He uses his own personal reminiscences about growing up in this era really well. It's a fine work of cultural history about a moment in the U.S. and the relationship between then and now is really powerful and provides a lot of explanation for what we're going through at the moment. And that's often what I look for from any kind of history. Is, can you give me some sort of, I don't want to know exactly what happened. I want something that is usable, related to the present and thus to the future. How, what happened, and where did these things come from? Where did these ideas and attitudes come from? And what is worth keeping of them? What can be adapted and what needs to be rejected? So it was a fine work, and I think as a book it leads well into some of the other historians of the post-war U.S. moment that I want to talk about in some of these little talks in future.